The smartest person in the room was the one carrying the water. Rain slid slowly down the 30-foot glass windows of the Marlowe Room, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, while inside, crystal chandeliers painted soft gold across polished marble floors and $1,000 suits. Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables, balancing a silver tray against one hand with the kind of effortless precision people stopped noticing after a while. That was the thing about waitresses in places like this. The wealthy rarely looked at them long enough to remember their faces. Claire preferred it that way. Table 12 needs another bottle of Bordeaux, her manager whispered urgently as she passed the service station. And smile this time. Those men practically own half the city. Claire nodded once. Calm. Professional. Invisible. Across the private dining section, Julian Mercer leaned back in his leather chair, checking the time on a silver Patek Philippe, while four investors from Dubai discussed market volatility over 60-year-old whiskey. At 39, Julian had built Mercer Capital into one of the most feared investment firms in America. Financial News called him brilliant. Former employees used different words. Ruthless. Cold. Untouchable. He had the kind of confidence that came from always being the smartest man in the room. And tonight, he looked bored. Claire approached the table with the wine bottle resting carefully against her arm. Another poor gentleman? She asked softly. Julian barely looked up from his phone. Depends, he muttered. Do you also give financial advice with the wine service? A few men around the table laughed politely. Claire began refilling the glasses without reacting. She had heard versions of the same joke before. Rich men loved testing people who couldn't answer back. Julian finally glanced at her then. His sharp gray eyes paused for half a second longer than expected. Not because of her uniform, because she didn't look intimidated. Actually, he continued, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, maybe you can settle something for us. One of the investors smirked. This should be interesting. Claire placed the bottle down carefully beside the candlelight. What can I help you with, sir? Julian leaned back slowly. Relaxed. Amused. If you had $10 million today, he said loudly enough for the table to hear, where would you invest it before the market collapses? More laughter. Soft this time. Expecting embarrassment. Claire's expression never changed. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above Manhattan. She glanced once toward the massive windows where rain blurred the city lights into streaks of silver and gold. Then she answered, municipal bonds before the next rate adjustment, she said calmly. Energy infrastructure while everyone's distracted by AI bubbles. And at least 20% liquid before commercial real estate starts dragging regional banks underwater. Silence. One man lowered his glass slowly. Another frowned. Julian's faint smile disappeared almost instantly. Claire continued pouring the wine as if she'd commented on the weather. Interesting. One investor finally muttered under his breath. Julian stared at her now. Fully. Carefully. Like he was seeing something he couldn't immediately explain. That's a very specific answer, he said. Claire met his gaze for the first time. Her blue eyes remained calm. Steady. You asked a specific question. The room went still again. Somewhere near the piano, a glass clinked softly against marble. Julian slowly set his phone down on the table. And for the first time that night, the billionaire stopped smiling. The silence around Julian Mercer's table lasted longer than anyone expected. Not awkward silence. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over a room when people suddenly realize they may have judged someone too quickly. Claire Bennett lifted the wine bottle again and calmly filled the final glass as if nothing unusual had happened. You mentioned regional banks, one of the Dubai investors said slowly, studying her now with visible curiosity. Why? Claire adjusted the bottle carefully onto the silver tray. Because office buildings are losing tenants faster than most lenders can refinance debt, she replied. The defaults will not happen all at once. That is what makes it dangerous. Julian leaned forward slightly. The amusement was gone from his face now. And you know this because? Claire gave the smallest shrug. Because numbers tell the truth long before people do. One of the men let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. Another exchanged glances with his colleague. Julian's fingers tapped once against the crystal glass beside him. Slow. Controlled. But Claire noticed it immediately. Men like Julian Mercer did not like surprises. Especially not from women carrying wine trays. You follow the markets closely for someone working dinner service, Julian said carefully. Claire met his eyes only briefly. Some people read celebrity gossip during lunch breaks. I read earnings reports. A few restrained smiles appeared around the table. Even one of the investors chuckled softly into his whiskey. Julian did not smile. He was watching her too closely now, studying the details. The way she spoke without hesitation. The way her posture remained calm under pressure. No nervous laughter. No desperate attempt to impress wealthy men. Just quiet certainty. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Claire picked up the empty bottle. Will there be anything else tonight, gentlemen? Julian's voice stopped her before she could leave. Actually, yes. She turned slowly. Sit down. The entire table looked surprised. Claire blinked once. I am sorry. Julian gestured toward the empty chair near him. 5 minutes. Explain your commercial real estate prediction. Claire glanced toward the dining room, where waiters moved beneath warm chandelier light, carrying plates of sea bass and filet mignon through the low hum of Manhattan wealth. I am working, she said calmly. I noticed. Julian's gray eyes narrowed slightly. I am also very curious. Before Claire could answer, the restaurant manager suddenly appeared beside them, wearing a nervous smile stretched too tightly across his face. Mr. Mercer, he said quickly, I hope everything is satisfactory tonight. Julian never looked away from Claire. Perfect. I am borrowing your waitress for a conversation. The manager laughed too fast. Of course. Absolutely. Claire's jaw tightened almost invisibly. She hated that tone. The tone wealthy men inspired in people. Fear disguised as politeness. 5 minutes, Julian repeated. Claire hesitated, then slowly placed the silver tray down beside the candlelit table and sat carefully in the empty chair. Around them, conversations in the restaurant softened. Not because people recognized Claire, because everyone recognized Julian Mercer, billionaire founder, financial genius, the man whose interviews moved stock prices overnight. And now he was sitting across from a waitress like she mattered. Julian folded his hands together. Start with the office market, he said quietly. Claire looked at him for a moment, long enough to realize something had changed. He was no longer trying to embarrass her. He was trying to understand her. Outside, rain continued sliding down the windows while taxis painted streaks of yellow light across the wet Manhattan streets. Claire finally spoke. Remote work changed behavior permanently, she said softly. But billion-dollar firms are still pretending people will return to buildings nobody wants to sit in anymore. One investor slowly nodded. Another leaned closer. Julian remained perfectly still, listening, really listening. And somewhere deep beneath the polished confidence and expensive tailoring, something unfamiliar began settling into his chest. Respect. Julian Mercer had spent most of his life identifying weakness in under 30 seconds. Nervous eyes during negotiations. Hesitation before answering direct questions. The subtle desperation people carried when standing near power and money. Claire Bennett showed none of it. That bothered him more than he expected. The candle between them flickered softly while rain continued tracing silver patterns across the towering windows behind her. Around the private dining room, conversations had resumed, but quieter now. Curious glances kept drifting toward their table. Julian ignored all of them. You are telling me, he said slowly, that billion-dollar firms are pretending the market is stable? Claire folded her hands lightly in her lap. Calm. Controlled. I am saying people with too much money rarely admit they made emotional decisions. One of the investors let out a soft breath through his nose, almost amused. Julian tilted his head slightly. And you think fear is driving the market? Fear always drives the market, Claire replied. Greed just gets the headlines. Silence again. Heavy this time. One investor slowly removed his glasses and leaned back in his chair. Another looked down at his untouched steak as though suddenly distracted by his own thoughts. Julian watched Claire carefully. The strange part was not her intelligence anymore. He had met brilliant people before. Analysts from Harvard, hedge fund managers from London, Nobel Prize economists who spoke like human calculators. But Claire did not sound rehearsed. She sounded certain, like someone who had learned lessons the hard way. Where did you study? Julian finally asked. Claire's eyes shifted briefly toward the piano near the bar, where a musician played soft jazz beneath the low golden lighting. Here and there, she answered quietly. Julian almost smiled. Deflection. Smooth deflection. That usually means somewhere expensive. Claire reached for the wine bottle again, gently turning it so the label faced outward. Small movement. elegant, practiced. Expensive places are not always the same thing as valuable ones. One of the investors laughed under his breath. I like her. Julian ignored him. You speak like somebody who worked in finance. Claire stood slowly from the chair. And you ask questions like someone who does not enjoy being unable to read people. That landed harder than anyone expected. Even Julian blinked once. Tiny reaction. Almost invisible. But Claire noticed. Of course she noticed. Men like Julian Mercer survived by controlling conversations. By staying 3 steps ahead. Claire had quietly stepped beside him without warning. You think you have me figured out? Julian asked carefully. Claire slid the wine bottle back onto the silver tray. No, she said softly. I think you are trying very hard to figure me out. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them shifted into something strangely personal. Not romantic. Not yet. Something quieter. 2 intelligent people recognizing each other beneath appearances. Then Claire stepped back into professionalism again like a curtain closing. Your guests probably want dessert menus. Julian almost spoke again, but stopped himself. The strange thing was he did not want the conversation to end. Not because she fascinated him. Because she unsettled him. There was a difference. Claire turned toward the dining room. Black uniform blending once again into the rhythm of the restaurant. Glasses clinked softly. Waiters crossed polished marble floors. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath cold rain and headlights. One of the investors watched Claire disappear toward the kitchen before quietly speaking. Julian. What? Your waitress is smarter than half the people managing venture capital in this city. Julian stared toward the hallway where Claire had vanished. His jaw tightened slightly. Then, without looking away, he reached for his phone beneath the table and typed a short message to his private assistant. Find everything on Claire Bennett. Full background check. Priority. By 11:30, the rain outside Manhattan had turned the streets into rivers of reflected light. Inside the Marlowe room, the dinner crowd had begun thinning into quieter conversations and half-empty wine glasses. Claire Bennett moved through the restaurant with the same calm rhythm she always carried. Collect plates. Refill water. Smile politely. Leave before wealthy men mistook kindness for invitation. But tonight felt different. She could feel Julian Mercer watching her even from across the room. Not constantly. Just enough. Like a man trying to solve a puzzle that refused to fit together. Claire disappeared briefly into the service hallway near the kitchen, tying her apron tighter as another waitress rushed past carrying dessert plates. What did you say to table 12? Her co-worker Emily whispered immediately. Claire looked confused. What do you mean? Those men never notice staff, Emily said quietly. Now they are all staring at you like you predicted the future. Claire reached for a tray of espresso cups. People with money panic when someone tells them the truth. Emily laughed softly. Well, your billionaire definitely looks panicked. Claire did not answer. Because part of her had noticed it too. Not panic exactly. Discomfort. Julian Mercer was a man used to controlling rooms with a sentence. Tonight, for the first time in years perhaps, somebody had interrupted that certainty without even trying. Back inside the dining room, Julian loosened his tie slightly while one of the investors signed the check folder beside him. You have not heard a word we said for the last 10 minutes, the older investor observed calmly. Julian reached for his whiskey glass. I heard enough. No, the man replied with a knowing smile. You are thinking about the waitress. Julian almost denied it. Instead, he glanced toward the hallway where Claire had disappeared moments earlier. She is unusual. She is educated, another investor corrected. There is a difference. Julian leaned back slowly in his chair. Educated people do not usually choose minimum wage jobs. The older investor laughed quietly. That tells me you still think success always looks expensive. Julian said nothing after that. Because the uncomfortable truth was he had spent most of his life believing exactly that. Expensive suits. Ivy League offices. Penthouse views. The world rewarded visible achievement. Claire Bennett did not fit inside that logic at all. His phone vibrated softly against the table. A message from his assistant appeared across the screen. Preliminary search completed. No criminal record. No social media presence. Former student at Wharton School of Business. Academic distinction. Withdrew 3 years ago. Julian stared at the message, then read it again slower. Wharton. For the first time that evening, genuine surprise crossed his face openly. One of the investors noticed immediately. What is it? Julian locked the screen without answering. But his mind was already racing now. Wharton students did not disappear into restaurant jobs. Not top students. Not people who spoke about market behavior the way Claire had. Something did not make sense. Across the room, Claire returned carrying fresh coffee service on a silver tray. The warm chandelier light caught briefly against the small gold necklace resting near her collarbone before she lowered her eyes again and continued walking. Julian watched her carefully. Different pieces were beginning to connect now. The confidence, the precision, the restraint. None of it was accidental. Claire approached the table once more. Calm as ever. Coffee before you leave, gentlemen? She asked softly. One investor smiled warmly this time. Only if you promise to explain what happens after the real estate collapse. A few quiet laughs followed. Claire smiled faintly while pouring the coffee. After the collapse, she repeated. The people who stayed liquid buy everything back at half price. Julian looked at her sharply. You really believe it is coming? Claire placed the silver pot down gently beside his untouched glass. Then she met his eyes again. I think, she said quietly, most powerful men only notice storms after the windows start shaking. And somewhere beneath the thunder rolling outside Manhattan, Julian Mercer felt something unfamiliar settle deep in his chest. Not amusement, not curiosity, respect mixed with unease. Midnight approached slowly over Manhattan, but Julian Mercer still had not left the restaurant. His investors were already gathering coats and checking watches while waiters cleared the final dinner plates beneath the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. Normally, Julian would have been the first man out the door. Time mattered to him more than comfort, more than sleep, more than people. Yet tonight, he remained seated with one hand resting against his untouched whiskey glass, watching Claire Bennett move quietly through the dining room like someone carrying an entirely different world behind her eyes. You are distracted, the older investor said calmly while buttoning his expensive wool coat. Julian barely reacted. I am thinking. About the market? No, the investor smiled faintly. That is what I thought. Across the room, Claire collected folded napkins from an empty table while soft piano music drifted through the restaurant. Her movements stayed precise despite the late hour. No wasted energy. No dramatic gestures. Just quiet discipline. Julian had spent years around people desperate to appear important. Claire did the opposite. She seemed determined to disappear, and somehow that made her impossible to ignore. His phone vibrated once again against the white tablecloth. Another message from his assistant appeared. Full report still processing. Additional note. Claire Bennett received multiple internship offers during graduate studies, including Goldman Sachs and Blackstone. Academic records indicate top percentile performance in quantitative analysis and macroeconomics. Julian stared at the screen for several seconds, then slowly locked the phone again. One of the investors noticed immediately. She really was in finance. Wharton, Julian replied quietly. The table fell silent. Even among wealthy circles, Wharton carried weight. Prestige, competition, power. Then what is she doing here? Another investor asked. Julian looked toward Claire again. That, he said softly, is exactly what I want to know. Across the restaurant, Claire stepped briefly into the service station and exhaled slowly while rubbing tension from her wrist. 12 hours on her feet had left a dull ache behind her calm expression. Emily appeared beside her carrying a tray of dessert spoons. Your billionaire is still staring. Claire reached for fresh linen napkins. He is curious. Emily smirked. Men like him are never curious about ordinary women. Claire paused for half a second, then continued folding the napkins perfectly straight. That is because men like him usually decide who matters before the conversation even starts. Emily studied her carefully. You really do not like rich people, huh? Claire gave the faintest smile. I like honest people. Before Emily could answer, the restaurant manager hurried into the station with visible excitement in his face. Claire, he whispered sharply. Mr. Mercer specifically requested you handle his table for the rest of the evening. Claire looked up slowly. They already paid. I know. The manager lowered his voice further. But apparently he wants coffee service moved to the lounge upstairs. Claire immediately understood what that meant. Private conversation. Exclusive seating. The kind of invitation most employees would treat like winning the lottery. Her expression stayed unreadable. I still have closing duties. I will handle them. Claire glanced through the doorway toward Julian sitting alone now beneath the golden lights, his expensive watch catching reflections from the rain outside the windows. He looked calm from a distance, controlled. But Claire had learned something important about powerful men over the years. The calmer they appeared, the more dangerous their curiosity became. Upstairs, the private lounge overlooked Fifth Avenue through massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Quiet jazz played through hidden speakers while the city shimmered beneath the storm outside. Julian stood near the glass when Claire entered carrying a silver coffee tray. He turned slowly as she approached. No audience now. No investors. No performance. Just silence and rain between them. Claire placed the coffee carefully onto the marble table. "You asked for coffee, Mr. Mercer." Julian looked at her for a long moment before answering softly. "No, I asked for you." Claire Bennett stood motionless for half a second after Julian Mercer spoke. Rain rolled softly against the massive windows behind him while the city lights below blurred into gold and silver streaks across the wet streets of Manhattan. The private lounge felt strangely quiet compared to the restaurant downstairs. Softer, more dangerous somehow. Claire adjusted the handle of the silver coffee pot in her hand. "That is usually not how coffee orders work," she replied calmly. Julian almost smiled at that. Almost. Most people would take that as a compliment. Claire placed a porcelain cup onto the marble table with careful precision. "Most people probably want something from you." The words settled between them gently, but Julian still felt the impact. He had spent years surrounded by people eager for invitations, access, money, influence. Women laughed too hard at his jokes. Men agreed with him too quickly. Employees watched his mood like stock traders watching market swings. Claire did none of that. She spoke to him the same way she would speak to anyone else. And somehow that unsettled him more than disrespect ever could. "You assume I always expect people to want something," Julian said quietly. Claire poured the coffee slowly, steam curling upward beneath the warm lounge lighting. "Do not you?" Julian looked toward the rain outside instead of answering immediately. Down below, headlights moved through Manhattan like streams of light cutting through water. "Most people do," he admitted finally. Claire slid the cup toward him. "That sounds exhausting." Julian let out the faintest laugh under his breath. "Genuine this time." "You know," he said, "you are probably the first person in years who has not tried to impress me." Claire leaned lightly against the edge of the table. Tired now, the long shift finally beginning to show beneath her calm expression. "That is because your opinion does not decide my worth." Silence again, but softer this time. Julian studied her carefully beneath the warm amber lights. The simple black uniform, the tired eyes she tried to hide, the intelligence that kept slipping through every controlled sentence. None of it matched the life she appeared to be living. "Why did you leave Wharton?" he asked quietly. Claire's hand paused against the coffee tray. Just for a second. But Julian noticed. Of course he noticed. She looked down briefly at the marble floor before answering. "You had me investigated quickly. I like understanding people." Claire gave a faint, humorless smile. "No, you like controlling uncertainty." Julian said nothing because the answer was accurate enough to make him uncomfortable. Claire picked up a small silver spoon from the tray and adjusted it beside his cup. Tiny movement. Deliberate distraction. "My father got sick," she said finally. "Everything changed after that." Julian remained silent. She continued staring at the spoon instead of him. "Hospital bills. Debt. My mother stopped working to care for him. Then she got sick too." Her voice never cracked. That was the strange part. Claire spoke about pain the way other people discussed weather forecasts. Quietly, without asking for sympathy. "So you left school," Julian said softly. Claire nodded once. "Some people have safety nets. Some people become the safety net." The rain outside intensified briefly, tapping harder against the towering windows. Julian looked at her differently now. Not curiosity anymore. Understanding beginning to form slowly beneath the surface. "You could go back," he said. Claire finally looked at him then. Calm blue eyes. Tired eyes. "That is what powerful people always think," she replied quietly. "That difficult chapters are temporary if you are smart enough." Julian frowned slightly. "And you disagree?" Claire picked up the silver tray again. "I think survival changes people permanently." The words lingered in the quiet lounge long after she said them. Julian watched her carefully as she turned toward the door. Then something inside him moved before logic could stop it. "Claire." She paused without facing him fully. Julian stood slowly from his chair near the window. Come work for me. The words hung in the private lounge longer than either of them expected. Come work for me. Outside the towering windows, rain continued washing over Manhattan, while distant headlights moved through the storm below like slow rivers of gold. Claire Bennett remained standing near the doorway with the silver tray resting lightly against her hip. She did not look surprised. That was what caught Julian Mercer off guard the most. Most people reacted immediately when he offered them opportunity. Excitement, gratitude, shock. Claire simply looked tired. You offer jobs to waitresses often? She asked quietly. Julian slid his hands into the pockets of his charcoal coat. Not usually. Claire studied him carefully now. The expensive watch. The calm confidence. The kind of polished authority men spent decades building. Then why me? Julian answered honestly before he could stop himself. Because you are wasting your mind in this place. The moment the sentence left his mouth, Claire's expression changed. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. Disappointment maybe. She lowered her eyes briefly toward the marble floor before looking back at him. That is an interesting thing for a billionaire to say in a restaurant full of working people. Julian frowned slightly. That is not what I meant. I know what you meant. Her voice stayed soft, controlled, which somehow made the words land. Harder. You think intelligence only matters if it makes money. Julian opened his mouth to answer, then stopped, because part of him realized she was not entirely wrong. Claire walked slowly back toward the coffee table and set the silver tray down beside the untouched cups. There are people downstairs working double shifts to feed families, she said quietly. People who are exhausted every day and still show up smiling because they do not have another option. She looked toward the rain outside the windows. That is not wasted. Julian watched her carefully. The strange thing was Claire never sounded defensive. She sounded certain, like someone who had already fought these arguments silently inside herself years ago. You could still do more, he said finally. Claire smiled faintly at that. Tired smile. Almost sad. That is another thing powerful people say all the time. Julian crossed the room slowly. You make that sound like an insult. No, Claire looked at him again. I make it sound expensive. Silence settled between them while jazz music drifted softly through the hidden speakers above. Julian stopped near the windows beside her. Up close, he noticed the faint exhaustion beneath her eyes more clearly now. The strain she worked so hard to hide beneath composure. How long have you worked here? He asked. 2 years. And before that? Claire hesitated for the first time all evening. Small hesitation, but real. Hospitals, coffee shops, tutoring. Julian looked surprised. Tutoring what? Economics mostly. A quiet laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Claire glanced sideways. What is funny? You are tutoring economics while carrying appetizers to hedge fund managers. Claire's expression softened slightly for the first time that night. Life has a sense of humor sometimes. The rain outside finally began slowing into softer drops against the glass. Somewhere far below, a taxi horn echoed through the city streets. Julian studied her reflection in the window beside his own. Two completely different worlds standing inches apart. Claire, he said quietly, I am serious about the offer. She folded her arms lightly against the cold near the glass. Why? Because I know talent when I see it. Claire turned toward him fully now. No, she said softly. You know usefulness when you see it. That hit him harder than he expected. Because for the first time in years, Julian Mercer could not immediately deny an accusation. Claire picked up the silver tray again and stepped toward the door. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Julian, he corrected automatically. Claire paused beside the doorway beneath the warm lounge lighting. Then, after a long silence, she finally answered without looking back. Good night, Julian. Claire Bennett left the private lounge without looking back, but Julian Mercer remained standing beside the rain-covered windows long after the door closed behind her. The city stretched beneath him in silver reflections and blurred headlights while her words replayed quietly in his mind. You know usefulness when you see it. Most people would have been intimidated after speaking to him that way. Claire had spoken with calm honesty instead. No fear. No apology. That was what stayed with him. Downstairs, the restaurant was nearly empty now. Chairs were being stacked carefully near the far wall, while soft jazz echoed through the fading warmth of the dining room. Claire moved through closing duties mechanically, wiping tables beneath dim chandelier light while the exhaustion in her shoulders slowly became harder to hide. Emily leaned beside the service station, watching her closely. So, Claire kept folding linen napkins. So what? Do not do that. Emily lowered her voice dramatically. You disappeared upstairs with one of the richest men in Manhattan for almost an hour. I deserve details. Claire shook her head faintly. He asked too many questions. Emily blinked. That is it. Claire stacked the final napkin carefully. And he offered me a job. Emily nearly dropped the tray in her hands. A real job. Apparently. Claire. Emily stared at her in disbelief. Do you understand how insane that is? Claire looked toward the rain outside the windows. Yes. Then why do you sound unhappy about it? Claire did not answer immediately. Because the truth was complicated. Part of her had spent years imagining someone finally noticing her mind instead of her uniform. Imagining opportunity arriving like a door opening after years of survival. But another part of her understood something dangerous about powerful men. They often admired intelligence only when it benefited them. Upstairs, Julian finally grabbed his coat and headed toward the elevator, but his phone rang before he reached the lobby. What? He answered distractedly. His assistant's voice came through immediately. I finished reviewing Claire Bennett's records. Julian stepped into the quiet marble hallway near the entrance. And her father died 4 years ago from complications related to a degenerative illness. Her mother currently receives long-term care treatment in Brooklyn. Julian's expression shifted slightly. How did she pay for it? Student loans. Multiple jobs. Private tutoring. She withdrew from Wharton 2 months before graduation. Julian remained silent while guests in expensive coats passed behind him toward waiting black cars outside. There is something else, the assistant added carefully. Claire Bennett turned down a junior analyst position from Blackstone before leaving school. Julian frowned. Why would anyone do that? The assistant hesitated. According to archived faculty notes, one professor described her as one of the strongest financial minds he had seen in 20 years. Silence. Heavy silence. Julian looked back toward the staircase leading upstairs to the lounge where Claire had stood beside the rain-covered windows only minutes earlier. Suddenly, the image of her carrying coffee trays felt almost surreal. Send me everything, he said quietly before ending the call. Across the restaurant, Claire finished tying the trash bags near the service station while the final employees gathered coats and umbrellas. Midnight had passed. Her feet ached. Her shoulders burned from the long shift. Yet her mind remained fixed on Julian Mercer's expression when she challenged him upstairs. Most wealthy men became defensive when confronted. Julian had looked thoughtful instead. That unsettled her more than arrogance would have. Claire grabbed her coat from the locker room and stepped outside into the cold Manhattan rain. The city smelled like wet concrete and traffic lights. She pulled her coat tighter while beginning the familiar walk toward the subway entrance half a block away. Then headlights slowed beside the curb near her. A black town car stopped quietly in the rain. The passenger window lowered slowly. Julian Mercer sat inside beneath the soft glow of the interior lights. His gray eyes met hers through the storm. Claire, he said calmly, let me drive you home. Rain fell softly across Manhattan as Claire Bennett stood on the sidewalk staring at the black town car beside her. Water shimmered beneath the streetlights while steam rose from subway grates into the cold night air. Inside the car, Julian Mercer waited calmly behind the lowered window, one hand resting against the leather seat beside him. No arrogance in his expression now. No performance. Just quiet patience. Claire tightened her coat against the rain. You really do not hear the word no very often, do you? Julian's mouth curved slightly. More than people think. Claire glanced toward the subway entrance half a block away. The familiar path home. Crowded trains. Flickering station lights. Another ordinary night. Then she looked back at the billionaire waiting beside the curb like a question she had not expected life to ask. I live in Brooklyn, she said carefully. I am aware Brooklyn exists. Despite herself, Claire let out the faintest laugh under her breath. Julian noticed immediately. Small sound. Honest sound. Different from the guarded calm she had worn all evening. 5 minutes, he said quietly. If you still hate the idea, I will never ask again. Claire studied him for a long moment through the rain. Powerful men usually pushed. Controlled. Expected. Julian was doing something rarer. He was waiting. Finally, she opened the car door and slid carefully into the back seat beside him. Warmth immediately surrounded her as the driver pulled away from the curb into the glowing Manhattan traffic. Neither of them spoke at first. Outside the windows, the city blurred into silver reflections and streaks of red brake lights across wet pavement. Claire kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Julian watched the rain trace slow patterns against the glass. "You really investigated me in less than 3 hours," she said eventually. Julian did not deny it. "You intrigued me." Claire shook her head faintly. "No, I interrupted your expectations." That earned a quiet smile from him. Maybe both. Silence settled comfortably this time, softer than before, the kind that no longer needed defending. After several blocks, the car crossed into Brooklyn, where the streets grew quieter and less polished. Smaller buildings, fewer lights, reality replacing luxury storefronts. Julian noticed Claire watching the neighborhood carefully through the window. "You think I do not belong here," she said softly. "I think you belong anywhere your mind takes you." Claire looked down briefly at her hands. "That sounds beautiful when rich people say it." Julian turned toward her fully now. "Claire." His voice carried none of the sharp confidence she first met earlier that night. "I know I came across like every other arrogant man you have dealt with." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "That is because you did." Julian actually laughed then. Real laugh this time. Warm and brief and unexpectedly human. "Fair enough." The car finally slowed in front of a modest brick apartment building beneath a flickering street lamp. Claire reached for the door handle, but paused. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof above them. "You asked earlier why I left school," she said quietly without facing him fully. Julian remained silent, listening. After a while, Claire continued. "You stop chasing impressive titles. You start chasing stability. Rent paid on time. Hospital bills covered. One peaceful night where nobody gets worse." Julian looked at her carefully beneath the dim interior lights. She sounded tired, not defeated. There was a difference. Claire finally turned toward him again. Most powerful men never understand that. Julian held her gaze for a long moment before answering softly. "Then maybe I should start learning." Something shifted in Claire's expression then. Small, almost invisible, but real. She opened the door slowly as cold rain and city noise spilled into the warm car. "Good night, Julian." "Good night, Claire." She stepped out onto the wet sidewalk and closed the door gently behind her. Julian watched as she disappeared beneath the apartment lights, carrying the same quiet dignity she had walked into the restaurant with hours earlier. No designer clothes, no wealth, no status, just intelligence wrapped carefully inside exhaustion and grace. And as the driver slowly pulled away from the curb, Julian Mercer realized something that unsettled him far more than market crashes or billion-dollar risks. For the first time in years, someone had looked directly at him and seen a man instead of a fortune.